Hey, how you doing? It's cold today. I was just like shivering. Brr. So as I like have this really awkward pause, I was just tripping over something that I wanted to talk about. Primary sources we know is a first person account, right? Somebody who was there, but they can be embedded in secondary sources. So if there's a scholarly article, a secondary source, but they have interviews or an oral history or a diary or photograph, those things can be primary sources. And so there's kind of a nuanced split between all of those. So I'm going to show you the four things that I found, and I'll talk to you how I found them. First one, out of the library, you could do search for like books and things like that, and they might have some primary sources in it, but we're really not attached to the eastern part of the United States. A lot. If we found like a great photograph from Boston, we might say you might donate this to a university out there. So our library catalog's not super fantastic. But if we go to my research guide for the history of communication, slow, awkward pause, communication, and communication. History of comm is the tab right here. You could search for things in some of the old historic newspapers that are close to Boston. So Baltimore, even though it's the target audience is people who self-identify as African American, it is in that date range, and you could look and see what's going on at that time. Chicago, well, that's not too close. New York Times, let me show you. That one goes back to like 1851. Pittsburgh is kind of close. Let me show you New York Times. Oh, but going back to that guide, while New York Times is opening, um, some of these other ones sometimes work okay, and this is where you would find the scholarly things. But remember, the primary sources can be found within these secondary sources. But if we're looking at New York Times historic, I can go to advanced search and I can type in Spanish flu or influenza pandemic or flu, all those things. And I could say, oh, let's just look in the title. Document title, not the publication. Publication's New York Times. And when we get down to it, we're looking at a bunch of different things with this topic. And we can narrow down to 1918 after the fact. So here in this date range, you can see, I bet this one shows up. What date are you? Oh, it's still loading. So there's a lot of medical things where they're looking back, like at old pandemics and things like that. 1950. Isn't it interesting that they didn't really talk about it in the teens? So let's go back. 1920, 1929. Let's see if they talk about it and what it narrows it down to. And New York is pretty close. So there's only 48 articles. Isn't that fascinating? Maybe it was more important as a pandemic to us in the past than it was at the time. Or was it called something else? That's something that you could cruise through. So that's one way to go. And you could try different keywords like Boston and disease, 1918, that sort of thing. And the New York Times might report about it. But that's the thing that I found. They didn't talk about it right off the bat. Another thing that I wanted to show you is, so here we have that same search that I had done. There's a website out on the open web where they gather resources from all over the United States, and it's primary sources, photographs, diaries, letters, things like that. And they're all aggregated here. And when you think about things like that, somebody from Boston might move somewhere else. So if you just type in Spanish flu or that other thing that I had done, or influenza, there's only 119 results, so that your results may vary. Or influenza. Ooh, now there's 5,540. And Boston. Oh, look at that. Nurses in Boston hospitals equipped to fight influenza. That's a primary resource, that photograph. So it might be just the language that you negotiate as you go, but some of these are primary sources. So the precautions against influenza, that's like publication by the Department of the Navy. But if you can find something in here that is like an interview or somebody saying something. So there's some to pick through there. There's not a lot to pick through, so that's one thing to do. So that's what I did the search there. The next thing that you can do is out on Google, there's something that I call a contextual search, where you can name the media or the type. We could even do primary, if I could spell primary source. Whatever you type before the colon is the context that it will search the keywords after the colon. So if that that didn't make sense. So if I say primary source, I'm only going to get Boston influenza 1918 things that are labeled as a primary source. But you could also do oral history, you could do diary, you could do film, recording, audio recording. And these are going to find the things that are out there. Like here's resources for history teachers. Some of those might be okay, some of them might be devastating. But here's like government archives, Boston, Massachusetts, and the 1918 influenza epidemic. Let's see what that is. Here's a primary source. This is weird. They've made it formatted like a newspaper. I wonder if this is like a K through 12 sort of a thing. But it is. There's some sources in there. So what's another thing we could do? Have you ever heard of an oral history? An oral history is where somebody has been a firsthand experiencer of something, but then later they're interviewed. So it might be like on their deathbed, it might be 20 or 30 years afterwards, but it'll come in the form of like stories. So here's the Library of Congress. Here's stories, and here we have like oral history of 70-year-old male. Not from Boston, though. So stuff like this you can weed through. And isn't that fascinating? They had them outside. And then here's a first-hand account. And it looks like they phonetically put it in there. I guess they died like fleas. So oral history is how I found that. And you can find those just by doing that oral history, Boston influenza, or Boston Spanish flu, 1918. All sorts of different things like that. Lastly, I was like, is there like an archive for Boston? So I did Boston. I think I did Boston primary sources. And so there's Massachusetts, there's Boston University has a research guide for primary sources. Just to save you the searching though, I did find something. It's called, let's push my browser down. It's called, I can't. digitalcommonwealth.org. I'll put it in here. digitalcommonwealth.org. So typically when archives are digitized, there's millions, trillions of photographs all over the place that haven't been digitized. So when a library or a social organization puts together an effort to digitize history, often it sticks to the region and it's published in the region. So we have like a Utah Digital Archives, there's a Mountain West Digital Archives, and in Massachusetts, Massachusetts, this one. So let's do influenza and search, and this probably will be the best one, because this will all be related to Massachusetts. So here's somebody who died, there's a tent city, there's somebody, but they're talking about London, staff at a hospital, letter from Lois, to W.E.B. Du Bois, a very powerful civil rights leader. That'd be cool. I bet they're all just like, I feel terrible. This influenza sucks. So here you can see all those different things. That might be the best way to go. When you're looking for COVID stuff, you can do the same thing as I did on this one. So, oral history, no space, COVID-19. There's a lot of people putting out oral histories right now or doing interviews. So you could do oral history interview, primary sources. Let's see if anyone's labeled it like that. Oh no, they're just talking about how to find source information about it. Okay, so oral history, photographs. If you go to Facebook, if you go to Instagram, COVID. So I could do that same search. COVID-19 hashtag on Instagram. Believe it or not, all of these are primary sources, I bet. No, I'm not looking for coronavirus info. Thank you. That's a primary source. Somebody wearing a mask. There's a primary source. Somebody protesting with an unsubstantiated medical claim about ivermectin. It's a primary source of a cute dog. You know, your results may vary. You're going to have to go through these. But these might be considered primary sources. So the difference between 1918 and now is we have the internet now and digital cameras, and the amount of media that we produce is huge. So your job is easier on this end. But I would say look at the oral histories for COVID-19, and you'll get people who have deliberately said, this is what life was like. I know that we're doing this because the University of Utah is doing this as well. So let's see, COVID-19 archive, oral history. Let's see if they have something that you could cite. Participate, browse, yeah. A Journal of the Plague Year. So these will be preserved and used for people doing research work just like you are in about 100 years, hopefully longer. So let me know if this helps, and I'm happy to help further.